Nope. Alassian Born, Chapter 3, Undone. He stared at his left hand in the short grass. It was daytime, and all was silent. He was flat on his stomach, on soggy turf. The right side of his face had sunk in mud, and his nose was full with the odor of it. A pungent, acrid smell, although perhaps it was the smell of the air. There was something in the air, or was it in his throat and lungs? Something that tightened his breathing. The mud was cold. He felt cold. There were raindrops on the back of his hand. He steered. The fabric of his trousers stuck to him, soaked and heavy. His right arm was pinned down by a weight. When he tried to move it, he couldn't. But the left arm, the one he looked at, he could move. He dragged it slowly toward him and propped himself over it enough to pull his knees under. He felt utterly exhausted and had to pause to catch his breath. He panted, pressing his forehead in the mud. When his breathing eased, he looked to his right and saw Tashira. Her head resting on his forearm, her mouth ajar, her eyes open and still. Tush! He stroked her damp fur, and his hand came back red with her blood. Tashi! He tried to call her name, but the word would not come out. She lay still. He sobbed and shuddered closer, his face in her wet coat, his weight over hers, and his arm crushed beneath them both. He shook her. Tashira! He called. She didn't move. Tashira! Tashira! He sobbed. He won his arm free of her weight so he could better shake her awake. He called her name again. She did not answer. She was dead. Her eyes looked at him and did not see him. She did not move, except from his shaking of her, which stirred her only faintly. Her mouth lay open, the tongue out on the grass. He thought how foolish he was. How foolish. He placed both hands on her body and called her life force to his will. But there was no life to obey his command. So he poured his own energies into her. He could heal her if he healed her wounds, if he healed her body. If only he could heal her body, if he was strong enough, if he could bring her back, if he could... He collapsed over her cold body and sobbed helplessly, uselessly. The wind howled over him. When he came back to awareness, he was drooped over Tashira's body and breathing shallowly. He was hungry and felt sick. His legs threatened to give in, but he managed to stand. Around him was a small glade encircled by tall, half-charred trees, the leaves of which were scarce and blackened. Dense grey fog filled the sky, and a gleam of day pierced through, casting shadows over the sodden grass. He did not know this glade. He had not been here before. A gush of wind brushed the tree branches, carrying the whiff of burnt wood and the smell of decay. He shivered. His body was stiff and seized by tremors. He hugged himself, but found no comfort in his own arms, wet with mud and blood, the blood of Tashira. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. It was a long while later when he turned his gaze away from her dead yellow eyes. He watched the jungle loom with grayness. The branches of the trees were half naked and sick, and when the wind blew, they moaned. He staggered forward. One step after the other, the mud swallowed his feet in loud gulps. He reached the trees, where the earth turned hard and dense with roots. Sticks and leaves and little plants bent and cracked beneath the soles of his feet. He treaded on warily over no path and in no particular direction. He was going nowhere he knew, and did not know why he was going there. He was going somewhere that wasn't here. He stumbled and recovered. He stumbled and fell. He got up and kept on walking. His labored breathing was all he could hear. Why was it all he could hear? He stopped to listen. His breathing quieted slowly. Then he heard silence. Dead silence. He hugged himself in his bruised arms, shifting his gaze to the world of energies. He could not quite see. His vision was blurry, and he was weak, hungry. The cold had eaten his strength away, and the long walk, and the run, and before that the explosion, the light, the heat, the debris, the black creature, and the stranger, and his father. His father was he? No. He had not seen what had happened, only felt it. He'd felt his suffering so terrible, and his cries and fear, the anguish. Then it had all stopped, all at once. He remembered that. He was sure he remembered that. Unless he remembered wrong. Maybe he'd lost consciousness. He had done that a lot in the last hour, was it? Had it been hours? Or maybe he'd gone too far to hear him. Perhaps he should go back. Yes, go back. But which way was back? He had been walking away from Irius, he thought. Though perhaps that wasn't true. Perhaps he had been headed toward it after all. Toward the battle. Maybe his father and the Fallen were still fighting. If he hurried, he could do something. But which way? Which way? Which way? He did not know this place, this empty place, this deathly place. There was no one here, not even animals. Gone, all gone. Maybe they were all dead like Tashira, like his father, dead. They were all dead. His legs gave way and he fell to his knees. What little power had brightened his sight now faded. The light of day had waned. The trees crowded about him, black and naked, like grasping hands in the fog. The jungle was ill. The day was ill. Maybe the world was dying. What was he to do? He was lost and alone. He tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't hold him. His body was trembling. No matter how tightly he hugged himself, it kept trembling and shivering. He had found no food and no water, although he had walked a great distance. Slowly, but he was sure that he had walked a great distance, heading away from Irius, or maybe toward it. He wasn't sure of that. His head ached, and he was hungry. Painfully, he crawled to an old tree with wide, fanned-out roots, which offered little protection from the biting cold. He curled into a ball with his back against the trunk and listened to his own weak whimpers. Like a lost pup without hope, bound to die alone, helpless in the growing gloom of dusk. When he opened his eyes, it was night. The trees, the leaves, and the ground were dark, shadowy grey, tinged with yellow and blue. The air was whitish. The air was a whitish murk. His heart beat fast, and he was panting. He was afraid. Something had woken him. He sat up and stretched his inner senses, listening. There were 7 of them. One was the Fallen his father had fought. He recognized him by the malice in his mind and the hunger in his heart. The other 6 he'd never heard before. They were like Alassians, but wrong. He cowered against the tree, making himself small. If he hid and didn't move, he would make it harder for them to find him, because they were here to find him. He had no doubt about that. He knew what they were after. It was obvious. He had understood a long while back. 13 years was a long time to be kept hidden from the world and be lied about why. One day he'd seen it clearly, as though a blindfold had been lifted from his eyes. He had never spoken of the matter because he remembered too well the day he had disobeyed his father, the fear and misery he'd caused. He'd had no wish to bring those feelings back. So he had kept his knowledge to himself, pretending not to know. But he did know. And now his father's most dreaded fear had come true at last. It was very near. A screech filled the silence, making him start. He pressed his back harder against the tree, feeling the rough bark pry his bones. He heard wood snapping. Something was nearby, something big and clumsy that made noise in the undergrowth. Yet he sensed no creature close by, and still he heard his sniffing, like wind rasping in a cave. There was a thudding, heavy steps, more snapping higher up in the trees, another screech. Something slammed down near him. He did not look at it, but sprang up and ran, bolting left and right through the trees. A thump beat the air out of him and hurled him forward chest first, his feet gone from beneath him. He plummeted to the ground, blind with pain, his body frozen. With a desperate effort, he stirred his focus to the pain. There was something cold, metal, a sharp point, a shaft, an arrow stuck in his chest. It had gone a few inches in, pierced a lung and cracked a rib. He dared not to breathe. He begged his life force to gather at the wound, to form into a sphere of energy and heal him. But the flesh could not mend while the weapon was inside him. He couldn't make his body move. His consciousness was slipping away. A weight slumped on his lower back and crushed him awake. He drew in air. With it came a stench of death that filled his throat and nose. He saw dark green scales, a jagged nostril, and a bloody black eye staring at him, at arm's reach. The draconic creature blew out foul air and made a low grattling purr. He heard a voice speak, but the words were swallowed up by shrieks. The beast snapped its head outside his vision, and the weight lifted from over him. Hands seized him and bound his wrists behind his back. Then the arrow was jerked out of him, and he screamed and forced himself to breathe through the pain. He was left lying on the ground, facing down. The globe of energy he had assembled stopped the bleeding. His flesh heated, mending slowly. The Falin, the enemy of his father, had begun chanting a droning rhythm. His voice, barely a murmur, shook with power, reverberating beyond the audible. Over his own struggling and panting, he could not make out the words. Wrestling the ropes that bound him, his forehead kissing the ground, little by little he got to his knees. Then the Falin said loudly and very clearly, "Ik aken ach, ishech uwa ek anma. Ik ach ben ach, in gnach ich." Ach eka uvishi ek. There was a silence, a deadened thump, then a blood-chilling bellow. He straightened himself up and half turned, only to be trampled belly up with his arms crushed beneath him. A wide, heavy creature shuddered and slobbered on top of him in a frenzy. Its slimy secretions stung him, burned him. A spasm clutched his gut, and he gulped in air as fire flooded his body. The agony seared at his navel, going deeper, sinking inside him, widening a hole. His very essence jerked and warped, writhing him, mangling him, while life was sucked out of him. His father's scream echoed in his ears, but it was his own voice howling now. Loudly and jarringly it screamed and wailed, until his own cry was all he could hear. And then he could hear nothing at all. Silence. Darkness. A presence in his mind. He opened his eyes and for an instant saw his father's face above him. The high canopy of sickened leaves looming overhead. Stubborn little leech. It was not his father. The stranger crouched over him, looking down on him, eyes filled with hatred, hair hanging like drapes at the sides of his face. With both hands he was pressing his head into the ground, pinning him down. And through that touch the Falin's mind was entering into his. He urged his life force to brighten his sight, and he saw the keeper's light glow white and strong within the Falin's form. Grief drowned him. In sudden desperation he pushed against the light. "I will break you," the Falin yelled, his face full of anger, the teeth bared and the nose wrinkled. "I will crush you. I will leave nothing of you. You will be nothing. Nothing." A wave crushed through his mind. He tried to stop it, but it forged ahead, growing oppressively, spreading like rot, stabbing everywhere, ruining him. His nose filled with blood. Heat licked from his nostril and ran down his cheeks to his ears. His tongue bathed in thick, bitter bodily fluids. His breath drew gore into his lungs, choking him. He could not breathe. He could not think. He could not see. Twisted things raced before his eyes. He did not trust them to be real. Images and sounds took shape in fast succession. He heard his father's voice and saw his kind, dimpled face turn into a grimace, screaming in agony and begging for him to stay, to not abandon him. He wondered whether what he saw was real. He thought it was a dream, it was a nightmare, but it was real. It happened as it had happened before. It hurt him as it had hurt him before. He died, and his father died. Yet they both lived. His father laughed and his face shifted, becoming the glowering face of a stranger bent over him, eyes shining red. The eyes had the guardian's power, and as they watched him, they scorched him from the inside out. Then he awoke. He was lying on the ground with his hands tied behind his back and his feet bound together. His father kneeled beside him, looking down, a grin on his face, a blackened hand descending to rest hot on his naked belly, and it slid inside, resolute and unstoppable, going all in, and the fire made him scream. He cried out in terror, but there was a gag in his mouth, so he heard only a muffled sound. He was awake, and everything was black. Cold and darkness pressed around him. His arms hurt. He was slumped over them supine. His breath came in labored heaves. For a while he listened to his breathing and the silence in between. He was alone. Alone with his hunger, his thirst, his pain, the cold, the darkness. He could see only darkness. He waited. When he thought nothing was going to happen, he tried to turn to one side so that he might relieve the pain in his arms and breathe more easily. The irons at his feet made this an arduous task. It seemed his whole body was covered in scabs, and the more he stirred, the more the wounds reopened and burned. The hurt made him meal through the thick cloth in his mouth. At long last he managed to roll to one side, but then his nose was stuffed. By then his nose was stuffed with snot, which made it somewhat harder to breathe, but it was less painful this way, for a moment. Then his arms began to prick and burn, so hard that he had to lash out, kicking and screaming and knocking his head on the floor. When the torment eased, he lay still, panting through his wheezing nose and with a hot sore on his temple. He did not know how long he lay alone, but it seemed a very long time. He fell asleep and had nightmares. They were the same nightmares as before. When he woke, he was biting hard on the gag, and the right side of his body, the side he lay on, hurt badly. He didn't sleep after that. He began to feel thirst above everything else. Water was all he could think about. Then they came out of nowhere. He did not sense their approach or hear their steps. He could not see them in the dark. They removed his gag and drowned his mouth with water. He tried to drink, but they poured too much too quickly, choking him. He coughed, and that displeased them. They smacked his face, then gave him more water. He was careful not to cough, nearly ran out of breath, gasping when it was over. He was thankful for the water, and thankful that it was over. Before he could speak, they stuffed his mouth with something like sand. It was most likely food. He wasn't entirely sure. He tried to swallow it. He choked. They beat him on the nose. It hurt and bled. He swallowed the blood and the sand that was food with it. After he drank and eaten, they forced the gag back into his mouth and left him alone. He lay on his back as they had left him, afraid they might still be watching. When after long nothing happened, he toiled to turn to one side. After a while, he succeeded. Eventually, he fell asleep. He awoke screaming in the gag, with nightmares racing through his mind. His body shivered in the cold. He crawled over the stone floor. It must be stone, for it was smooth, hard, and cold. Too soon he found a wall and sat up with his back against it. When his buttocks ached, he lay down again. Like so, the days passed. In the dark, there was nothing to see and nothing to hear. His eyes were blind and his other senses were deaf. His focus was sick and would not obey his will. He had not much of that, in truth, will. There was something in the darkness, something hefty and intrusive. It confused his mind. It made him see and hear things that weren't there, because there was nothing there. There was the floor, 6 square feet of it, give or take. There were 4 walls, tall enough for him to stand, but with the chains at his feet, he could take only a step or two, and very short ones. Then there was a metal door that opened only when they came to give him food and water, and to beat him if he coughed or tried to speak, and sometimes when he did neither. At first he thought they might eventually stop coming and let him die. He spent the hours pondering whether he'd rather they never returned. But whenever he felt he was closing in on an answer, the thirst would take his mind. Then he would think only of water. They always returned, but never before the thirst had dried his thoughts. In time he stopped wondering if they would come again. He knew they would. It was one of the few things he knew, the others being darkness, cold, hunger, thirst, pain, and the nightmares. He had countless of those, and they were all alike. He died in them, and sometimes he watched others die too, like this Falin, whom he thought he knew. He had chalky white braids, thick and long to his feet. His mouth had deep laugh lines, though he never smiled, and he never spoke. There was something about him, a light of sorts. This Falin must be lost in the darkness just as he was, and perhaps one day they would find one another. One day, perhaps, they would emerge from this place of darkness and meet. There was no harm in dreaming of the day, was there? But it never seemed to come, the day of his freedom. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Yet he thought time could not hold still forever. Something must happen, something other than hunger, or pain, or nightmare. There must be something else besides those things. A light, perhaps. At times he remembered a round yellow light. He did not know what this was, but he remembered the heat that emanated from it, remembered his body bathed in its heat. Yet his body had never felt warmth, and his eyes had never seen anything other than darkness. Still, he remembered the light. He remembered the warmth.